Hello, my name is Beck and welcome to a spoiler-free review of The Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. I just want to note that this is the second book in the Stormlight Archive, so if you haven't seen my review for The Way of Kings, I'd encourage you to just pause this review and just go there instead, because I don't want to accidentally spoil you by alluding to the first book, because this is a review for the second one. So without further ado, let's get into the review. Okay, now we are familiar with Kaladin, Shallan, Dalinar and Adolin. We're familiar with the setting and we're kind of familiar with some of the world building, and we know that something is coming. But what this second installment does in the series, it only amps things up more, because a lot of things were set up in the first book, and this really is a springboard that provides a lot of action that happens in The Words of Radiance, and that is why I love this installment. A few things that are happening are tensions between the High Princes are only rising and getting worse. We also have the Parshendi, and in the second book we actually learn a little bit more about them up close and personal, rather than just hearing about them kind of from the peripheral. And of course, lastly, we find out more of the backstory of the characters we now love and appreciate, so we get to deep dive even further into their characters. The Voidbringers are hinted at in book one as well, and now more information is coming to light about the oncoming desolation, so that is also something that the characters have to grapple with, like an oncoming storm. And we also know that the assassin in white hasn't died, and he has started to kill multiple kings, so he is a foe that has not disappeared. This book also had brilliant nuances of themes, because it touched on issues like classism and racism, and also identity, and it did this through the lens of the characters, specifically through Kaladin, who is a Dark Eyes. In this world, the Dark Eyes and the Light Eyes kind of have to coexist. Light Eyes are the ones that have more political power, and Dark Eyes are often equated with lower political power and the working class, and sometimes even lower. Because we get to see this political viewpoint through Kaladin now that a few of our perspectives have intermingled, we get to see his dialogue, his discussion, his emotions, like his raw emotions in response to this hierarchy. And that is what I really appreciated. It wasn't just an explanation of how things were working, it was a character exploration as well, which I think Sanderson does really well. And because of the intensity of a particular event that included these themes, I actually became quite teary and emotional, but only because of the way that this resonated, because of the build up to it. It wasn't like it was particularly gutting or sad, it was just something that really had a high impact because of the build up that Sanderson has done. This book also did something really cool, because it introduced, or rather it built on, the shard plate and the shard blade, and I'm going to try and talk a little bit so I can input some images and stuff, because there's a few different kinds of shard blades and we get to see some illustrations throughout the book, but my partner has actually done some awesome graphics for this series as fan art, so I'm going to put those in because they are relevant to this narrative. So dueling really becomes part of The Words of Radiance, and one of my absolute favorite action scenes in The Words of Radiance is a dueling narrative. I obviously won't spoil anything, but the way it's done is very cataclysmic, and Sanderson does not disappoint on his action sequences. And just building on from that, obviously there is an action sequence here, but there were action sequences in The Way of Kings, and the way Sanderson built more action scenes into The Words of Radiance, they really acted as a springboard based on what we already knew about the characters, what we already knew about the Parshendi and the war and the political struggles between the people of Roshar, and I adored all of the action sequences, and it's really what amped up the stakes in this book for me. This book receives a lot of accolades from me, but one of the things that I think that Sanderson doesn't do that well is romance, and it happened a little bit in The Way of Kings as well. The romance seems rather relaxed rather than full of excitement and tension for me. It's just something that also coexists between his characters, and so I don't get the romantic tension between, I was going to say the character names, but I'm not going to say because it'll spoil you, but I just don't necessarily believe the romantic notions between some of the characters, because it just seems like they are built up like a friendship. So I like the character interactions, and that is something that brings me joy anyway. So the way that they get along and the way that they interact is something that I enjoy, and it just happens to also be romantic. And it also doesn't take up a lot of the plot either. It's something that just happens alongside everything else. So the way that Sanderson writes romance into his books is the way that I prefer to read romance, but I just wish it had that little bit more tension in it to make it a little bit more zingy and exciting. So the focal points in this book are really the shard plate, the shard blade, the magic system, the spren, and the radiance themselves, and how they interact and intermingle with the magic system. We learn a lot more as well about the spren in this world, and it's something that I don't talk about very much during my reviews or my vlogs or anything, because the spren are so difficult to describe, but they're inherently just part of this world that's blended in so seamlessly. And the way that honor and oaths and spren interact in the second book is something that I just really loved seeing develop. So I guarantee that if you read The Way of Kings, you'll enjoy seeing this element develop as well, because it's something that just sweeps effortlessly through The Way of Kings and The Words of Radiance, and it really gets built on, obviously, like everything else. So I think it's something that Sanderson did very well. Like I said, he has a real strength with with world building, so the Spren definitely fall into that. Investigating the Spren also leads wonderfully into investigating the Radiant's powers as well, and their uniqueness and the way that it impacts them as people, and also how they experience it, trying to learn it, and all of the mistakes they make as well. I'm being really vague, but I need to be, otherwise obviously it'll spoil you, because discovering it is part of, without sounding too cliche, discovering it is part of the journey. So if you haven't already guessed, I'm sure you have, I gave Words of Radiance 5 out of 5 stars, and like The Way of Kings, at least the editions I have, this is split into 2 parts, you can see on the shelf behind me, and I gave both parts 5 out of 5 stars. Unlike The Way of Kings though, that had a cliffhangery kind of ending in the first part to get you hooked onto reading the second, but by book 2 we're already invested in the story and the characters. So the cliffhangery bit of book 1 in The Words of Radiance was more character focused and introspective, and had a looming sense of something is coming, rather than being an action sequence that cuts off and you don't know what the conclusion is. So Sanderson hooks you in a different way, and I like that there is that variation on the way that he pulls his reader in. However, that said, he also knows how to write an action sequence, like I said, and part 2 was built up with the best amount of payoffs ever. I absolutely loved it, and it's something that I remembered even years after reading the series, and I was so excited to revisit it because I would be rejuvenated by all of that world building and all of the content that came before this ending as well. It's probably one of his strongest endings that I've read, and it is why The Words of Radiance is the clear favourite of the Stormlight Archive so far, even though I've given all of the books in the series 5 out of 5 stars. Also on the ending, Sanderson made me cry, and he did that with the different themes in here, specifically the racism and classism one, but he also touches a lot on mental health and depression and suicidal tendencies. The way he handles mental health is very nuanced. He also has it very closely interlinked with a character's identity, and I love a character introspective identity book, and he really does that and delves deep into it with the characters that he's cherry-picked. So it's a very deep and very rewarding character study because you get so much detail, and that's one of the reasons that I love this series so much, because I just feel like I understand all of the characters and their unique views and perspectives. I also noticed a lot of these themes more succinctly in my rereading, because in the first time I read this, I was just so absorbed by the world building and trying to understand and remember all of the terms that I came across. But now that I've already read it, this is my first time rereading the books, and now that I am, a lot of clarity has come with that, because the first time through I kind of just had a rough idea of the magic system and I liked the characters, but the second time around I love all of the characters with all of my heart, and I understand the world building to the point that I could explain it to somebody else in detail. So this is a series that upon rereading is very rewarding, as well as reading it for the first time. And I think that ends my review. Obviously 5 out of 5 stars. Love this book, love this series. Thank you so much for watching this video. I will chat to you down in the comments, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye.